Good afternoon. I am Arthur Dean from the Office of Access and Inclusion. I'd like to welcome you all to this first year event of our lecture in the Madison Vision series. We have 3 more scheduled events scheduled this year. On Thursday, November 2nd, we will host a discussion panel on the impact of the Affordable Health Care Act on American healthcare landscape. On Tuesday, February 13th, Dr. Lynn Pasquarella from the Association of American Colleges and Universities will join us. And then on Thursday, April 15th, Jim Acosta, senior White House correspondent for CNN, will be here. We have an exciting year planned, and we hope to see you and your friends at each of these Madison Vision Series events. I would like to remind everyone to please either turn off or turn your electronic devices to silent, please, during the duration of this lecture and series. Additionally, if there are any students here in attendance that need to receive a passport stamp, that will be available in the lobby at the conclusion of the question and answer session segment of today's lecture. Through the Madison Vision series, we strive to elevate the discourse on our campus by bringing prominent lecturers, thinkers, and leaders who can help us look at our current civic landscape from different perspectives, and to think about what it means to create an engaged and enlightened citizenry. Through the Madison Vision Fund, we are proud to sponsor the Madison Vision series and want to say thank you to all supporters of the fund who have made this series possible. I would now like to welcome to the stage Holly Mendelsohn, co-owner and co-publisher for Insight into Diversity magazine. She will make a presentation to President Alger. After her presentation, President Alger will introduce our Madison Vision series lecture speaker today. Before the presentation, please allow me to share some information about Insight into Diversity magazine. Insight into Diversity is the oldest and largest diversity magazine and website in higher education today. In recent years, the magazine has strived to advance the national conversation about diversity and inclusion through thought-provoking articles on current trends and relative news, interviews with innovators, interviews with thought leaders and experts. They look to engage readers in the goal of achieving a more truly inclusive culture on both the academic and corporate campuses. I introduce you today, Holly Mendelsohn from Insight into Diversity magazine. Holly.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm here for a wonderful occasion. As Mr. Dean said, I am one of the owners and publishers of Insight into Diversity magazine, and our goal is to advance the national conversation about everything related to diversity and inclusion, higher education, underrepresented groups, and what we like to call, quote unquote, the outside world, which is linking higher ed to outside of higher ed. Excuse me for a minute, I'm just gonna put down my drink before it rolls down the podium. A number of years ago, we realized that nobody was really honoring the work that those who are dedicated to diversity and inclusion on campus were doing, and they were sort of the unsung heroes of the campus. So in 2012, we created something that we like to call the HEED Award, or the Insight into Diversity Higher Education Excellence in Diversity Award. It's a very rigorous, very comprehensive application, as those who worked on it will tell you. It's about 45 or so questions with a whole bunch of different moving parts, and it asks about everything that your campus is involved in regarding diversity and inclusion. And what we look for is to see if diversity and inclusion are really woven into the DNA of a school. We ask about retention programs and recruitment programs for students and for employees, best practices, leadership support for diversity, student graduation rates, supplier diversity, and so many other aspects to find out what's really happening on campus. The schools that receive the HEED Award are located throughout the United States, and they represent baccalaureate granting institutions, community colleges, law schools, business schools. This year is our 6th year giving out the award, and we are honoring 80 colleges and universities. Last year, we added a health professions element to it, so we have a separate award for medical schools, veteran schools, et cetera. And next year, we're actually going to be added a community college application to it because it's getting so big and so well respected. Within the schools that receive our HEAT Award, and James Madison University is one of the schools receiving the HEAT Award this year, I'm really so pleased to say, there are schools that are really standouts, ones that rise to the top. And we can tell by looking at the application what the school has to offer, how they answer the questions, the boxes they check to let us know about what kind of programs they offer. The reason I'm here today is that your school is one of those select schools that really rises to the top. We call these schools our diversity champions. We only have 14 of them, and they're only picked by us at Insight into Diversity. This is not something that you can apply for. This is something that we at the magazine decide on collectively. Diversity champions exemplify an unyielding commitment to diversity and inclusion throughout campus communities, across academic programs, and at the highest administrative levels. I want to put this in perspective for you so you understand how big a deal this is. Your school is one of 14, but there are nearly 5,000 colleges and universities around this country. So that's one of 5,000 colleges and universities. Granted, they don't all apply for our award, but you really are the cream of the crop. You really are the top of the top. So let me just tell you about a few things that make your school special and things that we see that really exemplify you as a leader. One is JMU strategically hired admissions recruiters who live in the underrepresented communities or regions within the Commonwealth. And what this does is it demonstrates a long-term commitment to the community and builds lasting relationships and university partnerships. It's so important. You have a wonderful professor in residence program. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a great program. It's a partnership with 13 high-need schools that provides faculty from JMU to assist in teaching and counseling activities that enhance the learning environment. And when students who have gone through it on the student level come here to JMU, the PIR faculty actually maintains a relationship with them on campus. Your Provost Faculty Diversity Curriculum Grants awards funding to encourage new course development or revisions or research that will enhance diversity in the curriculum. This year you created a disability minor, which focuses on theory and research on ability challenges, integration, and law. And I point these things out and the few others I'm going to mention because this sets you apart from other schools. Lots of schools have programs. These are unique to your school. These are really incredible. Your Valley Scholars Program will provide dozens of first-generation and low-income students the opportunity to earn a full tuition college scholarship and enroll here, and there's dozens of them every year. And very important, you've focused on enhancing faculty diversity, and you've really determined that it's a most important strategy for all hiring in academic departments. And so there's a few things that you've put together. There's many you've put together, but here's just a few highlights that you've created to make sure that this really happens. Everyone who's involved in a search committee is trained and informed about the importance of diversity to JMU. Your hiring language makes a clear and unequivocal statement that diversity is a core value here, and therefore anyone hired must demonstrate how they will contribute to this institutional core value. So what this means really is not only looking at the skill set and the academic background and the research and everything that the faculty has done, but what are they going to contribute to the campus as far as diversity and inclusion and moving things forward, and that's just as important as all the other skill sets. One other thing, you also have a network of relations with Howard University, Morgan State University, Tuskegee University through the Preparing Future Faculty program. So I just want to say that becoming a diversity champion is a tremendous accomplishment for your entire campus and something you should be very proud of. Now, we all know that campus diversity and inclusion can't happen without leadership, participation, and support. The number one thing about diversity and inclusion is it has to come from the top down, and I'd like to recognize a few people. First, it's obvious that President Jonathan Alger appreciates and knows the value that diversity and inclusion bring to your campus. President Alger has played an integral role in shaping, informing, and providing vision and leadership for all diversity, access, and inclusion efforts here at JMU. He has a career of being a champion for diversity. First as a civil rights attorney in higher education, later as legal counsel for the University of Michigan on some critical cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and has served to reaffirm diversity as a compelling interest in higher ed. At JMU, President Alger regularly attends, presents, shares vision, accountability, and support for university programs, events, and meetings that relate to and recognize and address the areas of diversity. I also want to recognize Mr. Arthur Dean and his team, along with all of the administrators, faculty, and staff, and students who have contributed to diversity and inclusion efforts on your campus. Arthur has served as the Executive Director for Access and Inclusion at JMU for 11 years and has been a member of JMU's senior leadership team since 2007. He currently has oversight of the Office of Equal Opportunity, Access, and Inclusion Initiatives for Campus and Community, Diversity Council Chairs, and key university initiatives related to diversity, access, and inclusion. And most important, however, I want to recognize that without everyone's commitment, and especially everybody sitting here every day, all the time, keeping it in mind, understanding how important it is, you would not have received this recognition. It has to be through and through the campus. So congratulations to all of you, and on behalf of the staff of Insight into Diversity magazine, it's my pleasure to congratulate and present the 2007 Diversity Champion Award and Insight into Diversity Higher Education Excellence in Diversity Award.
And folks, if we could have a round of applause for Holly. Thank you so much for being here. Everything she described is part of a team effort here at James Madison University, and there are a lot of people in this room that are an important part of that team and many others as well. So thank you to all of you who participate in those efforts. We've certainly made a lot of progress. We have a lot of work to do. And that is the nature of the university, but it's really a great moment to be able to take that time and celebrate what's been accomplished so far, even as we look forward. So thank you, Holly, so much for being with us today. Well, I'd like now to turn to start kicking us off for the 5th year, of the Madison Vision Series here at JMU. It's a few days early, but we are celebrating Constitution Day. Pardon me, I'm losing my voice here. As many of you may know, but we do, with this Vision Series, celebrate the Constitution, our country, and our efforts individually and collectively to be better citizens. Here at the university, that takes a variety of formats, that approach and those efforts. Our commitment to civic engagement is reflected through many programs and events. So let me just share a few exciting new developments that you might not be aware of. First, this year we have established the James Madison Center for Civic Engagement, led by new Executive Director, Dr. Abe Goldberg. And Abe, I believe, is here. Abe, would you stand? He's joined us from the University of South Carolina Upstate. Thank you, Abe. We are also, starting this year, JMU is hosting the new Virginia chapter of Campus Compact. And those of you that aren't familiar with that, it's a national organization focused on community and civic engagement for higher education and for our students. And I believe I saw Roland Johnson here as well, who's our brand new director, moving to Harrisonburg this coming weekend. So welcome to Roland, who joins us from Johns Hopkins University. There he is. Okay. Thanks, Roland. JMU is also represented by Student Government Association President Jewel Hurt and by me on the Governor's Task Force on Millennial Civic Engagement. That task force is working to get college students more involved in the democratic process. And as you saw this week, the university has formed a brand new task force on inclusion to facilitate dialogue across differences and to help our campus community address challenging issues together. As citizens, we can and must stand up and get involved. As James Madison himself believed, citizens have to focus on their responsibilities as well as their rights for the bold experiment of the Constitution to succeed. And that brings us to today's special guest. On September 17th, 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met to sign the document they had created, of course, the Constitution of the United States. And to mark the 230th anniversary of that historic day, we are fortunate to be joined in our celebration by Linda Monk, widely known, and I love this, as the Constitution Lady. Linda is a recovering lawyer, which is something I can personally relate to, and she's also an educator at a national level. Linda is a constitutional scholar, a journalist, and a nationally award-winning author of numerous books, including The Words We Live By, Your Annotated Guide to the Constitution, and The Bill of Rights, A User's Guide. I personally have read The Words We Live By recently, and I can tell you it's a wonderful resource and teaching tool. I learned a lot, and there are a lot of really funny stories and anecdotes that help to illustrate how the Constitution and its provisions came about. So Linda, thank you for your many contributions to the field. She has also consulted for PBS, written for many different publications, and is a visiting scholar for the National Constitution Center. In the small world category, Linda was a law school classmate of our former governor and current Senator Tim Kaine, and his wife and former Virginia Secretary of Education, Ann Holton. Linda is certainly a great thinker, but she's also a doer. She truly has the courage of her convictions. Let me just share one brief anecdote to illustrate what I mean, and we heard about this at lunch today. Last November, while distributing literature for candidates at a polling place in North Carolina, a man on his way out told her, "You're going to get shot for doing that." In the face of this very chilling threat, Linda pressed on with her work. Upon reflection, Linda noted that this was the first time in 40 years that anyone had ever threatened her while voting. As she said, "It let me know that I'm going to have to do a lot more to defend the Constitution than just write good books." The recent events in Charlottesville remind us that it's not always safe or easy to stand up for our democratic principles, even today. Linda's story should serve as a wake-up call to all of us that we need to work hard to develop models of civic engagement and civil discourse in a society that's becoming ever more diverse. University campuses must be a place in which we can help people learn how to discuss and debate ideas and share a wide range of perspectives in ways that are healthy and productive, not threatening or intimidating. We can't take the Constitution for granted, and we can't take our democracy for granted. Every generation has to act to carry that flame of freedom forward. That's why we sponsor these events, and that's why Linda is here. I love Linda's title for today, We the Whole People, Creating a More Perfect Union from Imperfect People. The types of efforts recognized a moment ago by Insight into Diversity are directly related to the strength and vitality of the Constitution today. So as imperfect people, we have much work to do to continue to create a more perfect union. That work may have started with James Madison and his colleagues, but it continues today with all of us. So please join me in welcoming the one and only Constitution Lady, Linda Monk.
How y'all doing? I feel kind of like Minnie Pearl. I'm proud to be here. I'm very proud to be here, and especially to this audience at this time. We all looked on in shock at the events in Charlottesville, and we all hoped that maybe we would have some courage to stand up in the face of hate, to stand up for what we believe in. Well, I'm here to tell you, and so is the magazine that just awarded your community, that you do it every day, day in and day out, when people are looking and when people aren't looking. And I've never been more proud to speak to any audience than I am to be here today. And I have to kind of tell you, I'm a fangirl for little Jimmy. I tell you, when we constitutional scholars get together, okay, and there aren't as many women as there should be, but we argue over who gets to be one of the Madisonettes, okay? I want to see that happening. And you also will just need to know out front that if anybody starts telling me about Hamilton, we're going to have a smackdown. Because we've already planned it. We're going to ask Spike Lee to play Little Jimmy, and we're going to get our own darn musical. And we're going to correct some of those errors that were in there. I love James Madison, and I love him speaking in that term of diversity, because he was a man who understood, I think, as much as a man of his time could in his situation. He began to understand what it was like to be an underdog. And starting out, to be 5 feet tall and 100-pound sweat amongst all those good-looking tall Virginians, that was hard. And he got his heart broke twice. Aaron Burr had something to do with that, too. We'll put that in the musical. And Thomas Jefferson kept egging him on and egging her on, and then he got his heart broke. Now, what good a friend is that? But he understood what it was to be an underdog. He also understood about freedom of religion. And so these days, sometimes I call James Madison the Rodney Dangerfield of Founding Fathers. Those of you who are too young don't know that, but he doesn't get enough respect. We're going to change that, right? I'm calling on the Dukes right now. We are going to change that. The freedom of religion that he advocated and that he modeled has really been America's unique contribution to the world. And I want him to get more respect for that. When he was running for office here in Virginia, those of you who may already know, there was a fellow named John Leland who was a good third-party candidate because he knew what third parties are really supposed to do. If you're behind anyway, you're supposed to endorse the other guy if he'll do what you want. So our First Amendment that we celebrate today was that John Leland, who was a Baptist leader. And James Madison helped. Now, I'll try and step off of my fangirl podium for just a little bit now, because today we're going to talk about the imperfections in the Constitution, the imperfections in our system of government, 1787 forward. And what I'd like to propose to you is that the Constitution was imperfect when it was signed. George Washington and others said that. They said there was an amendment process, so it's on us to keep fixing it. And I want you to remember, too, that the Constitution that we celebrate today, it was our second Constitution. The first Constitution, as you probably remember, is the Articles of Confederation. It lasted through the Revolutionary War, so that meant it was pretty good to defeat the most powerful military on earth. But it didn't have, by the lights of that day, a stronger federal national government. But you know what? When the Constitution was written, 1787, in the preamble, what does it say? We, the people of the United States, point 1, in order to form a more perfect union, okay? That wasn't just make-believe, that was literal. They were only 6 years away from their first Constitution. I forgot, Bill of Rights, I forgot. We're having our second Constitution. And remember that when they drafted that Constitution, it was in the same hall, Independence Hall, that they'd just been in 1776. That's only 11 years. So I want us to remember that the founders who came there came with a sense of failure as much as promise. We are a nation that in our most important document of government says, more perfect union, we failed. That means we got it wrong. We're going to say that from the first. Here's our second attempt. Now, when I talk about we, the whole people, I'm going to give you lots of different illustrations. I'm going to use primary sources from the people of that time. I want us all to summon the ancestors because they're not any different from you and me in the struggles they had and the way they put their shoulder to the wheel. And so when we honor the past, we're also acknowledging the present and hoping for the future. So join with me in this little time machine and let's see what it teaches us for JMU today. Here's probably my favorite of all things that James Madison has written in terms of one sentence, and that's pretty hard for me because I'm a writer, so I love a writer. I know how hard it is to take those complicated ideas and try and make them understandable. These two sentences, I think, really sum up what our government is about. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? Doesn't that, that sums it up, right? We're never going to get any government that's better than we are. And we are imperfect. The second point, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So what Madison, and I'm going to give Madison the main credit for this because he's the architect, he's the structuralist. He's like, in the Enlightenment at that time, they believed in deism, that the divine was kind of like the great watchmaker in the sky that got the mechanism right and then kind of set it to go. Madison's kind of like that watchmaker. He's trying to tinker. One scholar talks about the Constitution as a machine that would go of itself. You read a lot of the Federalist Papers, and what Madison is saying is people are going to mess up. Ambition must counter ambition. They're going to have flaws and failures. And so he's going to try and help set up in the structure of government to counter that. Now, remember I told you we were going to have a little throwdown about Alexander Hamilton? What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? Hamilton would not say that. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Hamilton would not say that either. He'd say, I'm an angel. I want to be the king of the world. And the only thing that was keeping him back was a little indiscretion on his father's side. Okay, I told you there was going to be a throwdown about Hamilton, so let me just say this and get it out of the way. I love Hamilton the musical. I love Lin-Manuel Miranda, the genius who put it all together. And like every other great artist of his time, he takes artistic license with the story. Alexander Hamilton was not an immigrant. He did not consider himself an immigrant. He was a subject of the British crown, and so that particular piece of the story is not how Hamilton saw himself. That's a footnote. Let's talk about something else. I'm going to take this roughly in chronological order. I'm going to bring back some images that were contemporaneous. I'm going to bring back some direct sources. And I'm going to invite you to join in this with me to see who were those people who were not included in We the People and what they had to say about it at the time. Let's start with this Revolutionary era. And let me just start. This was a cartoon that was published around the time 1774. You may have heard of this thing called the Boston Tea Party. Well, there was also a tea party in Edenton, North Carolina. Has anybody heard of that? Just kind of wave. Oh, come on. Big wave. There you go. There you go. All right. Edenton, for those of you who don't know, is in the Albemarle Sound. It's on the North Carolina-Virginia border. It was a great merchant hub at the time. And these are the so-called Patriotic ladies of Edenton, North Carolina, on roughly October 25th, 1774. Now, Can you guess that they probably didn't do that drawing? We're talking about fake news and analyzing sources. Can anybody, let's see. Well, you see that's on the table as they're signing. Pretty long, too, because they had 51 signatures. And by the way, these were the most wealthy and influential women of that town, which had a lot of import business because North Carolina didn't have its own major port. So these were some significant business relationships. And they signed for women at that time in that culture to sign a document that actually precedes the Declaration of Independence. So we're talking about lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. These are 51 women who are putting their name on essentially a non-importation agreement. And the cartoon that you see was published in England as a farce because these ladies are clearly not attending to the proper business, right? Look, see who's on the floor? The little baby, and dogs licking babies in those days was not a good idea. It was not popularly approved of. If you look at the on your far right at the what's going on in the fireplace, the man who's we would regard as assaulting the lady at the table now, they're generally not being presented as very reputable, certainly for an English society. Kind of rabble-rousers, no good. Well, here's the quote that appeared along with this cartoon called The Patriotic Ladies of Edenton. Their English reporter is saying, or writer is saying, the only security on our side is that there are but just a few places in America which possess so much female artillery as in Edenton. They were joking. But, whoops, here we go. Okay, forgive me about being, all right, we'll get it. Patriotic Ladies at Edenton. There we go. Is this something you would have thought of about women at the Revolution? We hear a lot about Abigail Adams. I won't diss her, although I could. I support Woody Holton's biography of her, where she was buying up script from poor veterans on pennies on a dollar that she'd later cashed in for many, many times that when Congress decided to pay its debt. Abigail Adams, being a woman of influence, would write to John and say, remember the ladies. I'm not disparaging that particular remark, but these are the ladies who are worth remembering. These are the ladies who put their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to the task. And they weren't alone in this revolutionary era. Remember, we talk about the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that's your Jeopardy question, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That one sentence, our revolutionary credo means I believe. So if anybody asks you what you believe as American, there it is, right there. When that document was signed, of course, we know the reality for Native Americans and enslaved Americans. I'm wondering if you've heard of this primary source document. The Petition of the Massachusetts Slaves. Remember, at the time of the Declaration of Independence and at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Paris, 1783, slavery was legal in all 13 states. All 13 states. So when we talk about slavery, it's important to remember that it's a national system that becomes regionalized, but it's still a basis of a national economy. So not to exonerate slaveholders, but also not to exonerate the people like Alexander Hamilton, whose wife's fortune came from slaveholding. It was a national system. Our national economy depended on it. And many scholars, including myself, believe today that we still have the badges and incidents of slavery, and our economy still reflects that. Well, let's see what the slaves of Massachusetts had to say at the Declaration of Independence. You may find some of this language familiar. Your petitioners, remember, they are sending this to the Massachusetts legislature in Boston. These are the people who have legally enslaved them. These are the people who have legally enslaved them. And here's the petition that they're sending. Your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right, does that sound familiar? To that freedom which the great parent of the universe has bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever. There's social contract theory right there, straight out of John Locke, and it's being cited by the slaves of Massachusetts. And here's the follow-up. It's a much longer document. I commend it to you to read the whole thing. Your petitioners cannot but express their astonishment that it has never been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of their unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of your petitioners. They're saying, you're hypocrites. We judge you as hypocrites. The future is going to judge you as hypocrites. So for any of you who were taught, like I was, the Declaration of Independence without this document, your education is incomplete. When you look at a primary source analysis, this is a significant document that reflects that at our founding moment, these principles were being argued and debated by everyone in the society. Everyone. It's not just the property of a certain few great men, although they may have been great men and were great for their time. Let's move forward now. Let's look at another voice that was not heard. We're hearing a lot about Andrew Jackson in our current political climate. This is a case to which Andrew Jackson was not a party, but he certainly was involved in. For those of you who don't know, or don't remember, or haven't studied it in your history yet, the southeastern United States belonged to the 5 so-called civilized tribes that had acculturated with white ways, including many going to boarding schools, being educated, holding a lot of property that was held in common, which British people and American people did not like that much, because then you couldn't sell it and subdivide it for a lot of the new immigrants from Scotland and Ireland that were coming in and other places as well. This is John Ross. He was the principal chief of the Cherokee at this time around 1831, the time of what would be known as the Trail of Tears or the Great Removal. Remember I told you about those 5 civilized tribes? It's a massive, massive, it was a massive ethnic cleansing. And I don't use that term lightly, because these native people, the Cherokee in particular, were moved during the dead of winter, and you had soldiers for the army at that time saying they'd never seen people treated so cruelly. This is John Ross, the principal Cherokee leader, who's trying to fight this in the Supreme Court. We don't hear about that a lot, about Native Americans who have a special status under the Constitution. Remember in Article 1? The Congress has absolute power in terms of dealing with the Indian tribes. The Cherokees were one of the tribes that had settlements in villages and towns. They tended to be traders between tribes that were further, or nations that were further in, and the English. As you know, that they allied with the English at various times and had therefore had some animosity with the newly independent Americans. But they also had treaty rights that George Washington himself had signed, and under the Constitution, only Congress could deal with them. Well, and then what happened was gold was discovered in Georgia. And there was a vast influx of people who were essentially squatters. They were European American squatters, so that's not what they called themselves. They called themselves pioneers. And there was a lawsuit about it because Georgia was trying to say, wait a minute, you know, Massachusetts got rid of all the Indians. Seriously, these were the arguments. I'm not being facetious, you know, and Rhode Island, et cetera, 100 years previously had wars to reclaim that property. Georgia says, okay, now it's our turn. We own all this land to the Mississippi River. The king gave us a charter that said so. And it's our land, no matter what the Constitution said. So the case made its way to the Supreme Court. At first, John Marshall does what all good Chief Justices are supposed to do. He punts. No jurisdiction. I don't have jurisdiction. This is an original case of original jurisdiction, but we don't have that where the Indian tribes are. Remember Marbury versus Madison? Same principle. Then a good Methodist missionary figures it out because the Methodists were actually reaching out into the Cherokee. The Cherokee had a lot of intermarriage with the Scots. As you notice, Mr. Ross looks like someone with European heritage. He has a significant amount of European heritage because in the Cherokee Nation, it was matrilineal. You were a Cherokee because the Cherokees said you were. The whole notion of blood quantum, and you had to be a certain percentage, that is totally a European idea that was imposed on Native Americans. And the reason it was imposed on that because they wanted to limit how much money they owed them for either buying land or resources. So here's John Ross. He's gone to a school for Native Americans. And Cherokees also owned slaves. They were very good mimickers of white culture. And he wanted that property recognized as well. And when the Cherokees finally move and take slaves with them, this has been a recent last 10 years controversy of the slaves that were with them that considered themselves Cherokee were not acknowledged by the tribe. But let's see what John Ross had to say. Now, this is a petition. You can actually see it at the Native American Museum. These are petitions with like 30,000 signatures on them. Seriously, it's like this big. And it's in the Native American Museum. And here's what John Ross had to say. He said, little did the Cherokee anticipate that when taught to think and feel as the American citizen and to have with him a common interest, they were to become strangers and wanderers in the land of their fathers. The treaties, laws, and Constitution of the U.S., their bulwark and only citadel of refuge put beyond their reach. Because what happens? There's a second Supreme Court, John Marshall and the court rule in favor of the Cherokee position, which is that Georgia has no authority to impose law on them, only Congress does. And then Andrew Jackson reportedly said John Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. The missing point that we're not told, but is true, is that there was something called an Indian Removal Act. Congress. And I would remind you of that even today. A lot of times when the president's being blamed for things of either party, it comes back to Congress. Congress has the most authority under the Constitution. Of 4 pages in the Constitution, Congress has almost 2. John Marshall said that words in the Constitution are not without meaning, so you get the most words, you generally get the most power. At the Trail of Tears, when the Native Americans are sent to live in what becomes Oklahoma and are put through that process, it's believed, at least amongst the Cherokees, and by the way, each tribe has their own version of the Trail of Tears, a quarter of the population died. This is one of my personal heroines. We're talking about now, we've just moved from the 1830s, and what's happened with removing the Indians. It's essential to what becomes a speculative economy. You've got the invention of the cotton gin, you've got agriculture in Virginia is starting to be depleted to the extent that the white people in Virginia who owned slaves realize that their basic commodity is to sell those slaves deeper south, what's called the Second Middle Passage, because families that had been together for generations are broken apart to never see each other again or even be in contact, to go through that forced march into the deeper south. We've moved out the Indians now. Cotton is a speculative economy. You've got a lot of people rushing in that want to make a lot of money very quickly. And what do at the expense of human beings? With this person who's my heroine, Lucy Stone, she is one of the first people, definitely the first woman, and amongst the first people to be paid to speak as an abolitionist. To be paid to speak as an abolitionist. And those were in days when women weren't supposed to talk. It kind of sounds familiar, right? Women weren't supposed to talk, weren't supposed to talk in public. We're not even getting to voting yet, we're just trying to speak. She would give 2-hour orations. I know we think that's boring. That was entertainment then, and she did a good job. And she would have male hecklers that would try and shout her down. In fact, one of the popular slogans was that they would give a reward to the man who with a kiss shuts up the mouth of Lucy Stone, meaning marry her. Now, why we haven't heard more about Lucy Stone? Well, she got into a fight with Elizabeth Cady Stanton about who should have the right to vote first. And so she wasn't included in the history books. But I'm here to sing her praises because Lucy Stone, besides being an abolitionist, one of the first women to go to college, she's the one who brought this point up very early and very explicitly. We the people, she said, talking about the Constitution, which we the people, the women were not included. Remember, that's the era of what's called couverture, or the idea that when a woman marries, the woman and the man become one, and that one is the man. So she put off getting married. Finally, she decided to get married, but she wanted to keep her own name. And that's near and dear to my heart because ever since I was a little girl, I always knew I wanted to keep my name. My uncle kind of hitched up his britches and said, "Well now, little lady, I don't think you're going to have much choice about that, are you?" And I told him, "Well, Uncle Joe, you know, I mean, it's not a law, it's just a custom." And I thought the ground was going to open up in front of him. Men, God bless them, and I love them, but stop trying to define what your women are supposed to do. Stop doing that, it's not helpful. And Lucy Stone called it out. And she kept her name, and let me tell you to what extent this goes. She kept her name after she got married. She and her husband did this incredible declaration to that effect. She's living in Massachusetts at the time, which we think of as very liberal, and certainly today. But as under the Constitution of Massachusetts, she's entitled to register to vote. She goes down and registers to vote. They will not allow it unless she uses her husband's name. She would sign her papers, Lucy Stone only. So here's a woman who fought all of her life for abolition, and then after abolition, she supported the 15th Amendment when some people thought there shouldn't be a 15th Amendment unless it also included women. And she never was able to vote herself because she wanted to keep her own name. So I'm introducing you to some people that I consider amongst the founders of this nation. And we use that term founding fathers a lot. I like to talk in terms of the founding generation because to me that includes the slaves of Massachusetts. But I've got a very special founding father to introduce to you today. Born in Virginia, Does anybody recognize this man? Keep going. Who said Dred Scott? I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Ethel Dred Scott of Virginia, who was sold as a slave. Remember I told you about that middle passage? He was sold from Virginia and had a variety of people who claimed ownership over him, including at times in Missouri and Louisiana. This is Mr. Scott. His case took over 10 years, and it winds up in the Supreme Court. I hope you've heard of the Dred Scott decision. I prefer to call him Mr. Scott. I also want you to remember, I'd like to introduce you to the Scott family. The case that involved Mr. Scott was not just about him. That's one of the techniques. There's so many techniques of oppression, right? There's so many techniques of oppression. And one of the things that you do it's called internalizing the oppressor. One of the things you do to internalize the oppressor, if you're the oppressing part, is to strip a person of any relationships. So we don't talk about the Scott family, we talk about Dred Scott. We don't call him Mr. Scott. That picture that you see, by the way, was taken right around the time of the decision in 1857. And let me tell you a little bit more about that case. You notice I used that term, we the whole people, over Mr. Scott, who under the terms of our Constitution did not count as a whole person. And one of the things I'd like to add to this discussion is that recall that counting a person as a whole person under the Constitution did not free any slave. What it did was give more power to slaveholding societies. And to not count a person at all who was enslaved was to diminish the power of the slaveholding societies. So when we discuss this compromise, so-called, remember that the people who are opposing slavery don't want to count slaves at all in the population because that just gives the slaveholding states more power. Let's talk about Mr. Scott. He's sold several times. And at one point, he is taken into Missouri under precedent at that time, both in Missouri, and he's also later taken to Louisiana. Both of the legal precedents at that time say, once you've gone into free territory, that's it. But you have to get a lawyer to take your case. And if you remember, you're enslaved the whole time, so you're still dependent on someone else for your legal status, for your support, etc. When Mr. Scott goes into the Wisconsin Territory, Illinois Territory, he meets a woman named Harriet and falls in love, and they are married. They are married under a justice of the peace, which then becomes evidence for him later. But she too is enslaved. She goes back with him to Louisiana with the person who claims ownership on them. On that trip, they have a daughter who's born. Her name is Eliza. You see those lovely girls to the left of Mr. Scott? They have another daughter named Lizzie. And though the case could have been brought before, it's Harriet, it's Mrs. Scott, who is the instigator. She's involved in a church. Churches are where you find help, and she finds people who will support their litigation because the girls are getting close to 10 years old. And when they get to be 10, their mama and daddy don't have as close a connection with them anymore because that's when they get to be valuable in the master's eyes. So she keeps instigating. That case goes all the way to the Supreme Court over 10 years, becomes the most infamous case in Supreme Court history. Every constitutional scholar you talk about will say that the Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott v. Sanford, is the worst decision in Supreme Court history. It's the worst in terms of not following precedent. It's the worst in terms of the president at the time, James Buchanan, is actively lobbying court members to say, we got to solve this sectional crisis somehow. We got to solve it. We don't want to have a war. You, Supreme Court, solve it for us. And by doing so, they strike a match to the country, because by ruling that a black person could not ever, free or slave, could not ever be a citizen of the United States, they are defining that issue, they think, we the people, forever. Chief Justice Taney says they are not constituent members of the sovereignty. Constituent members of the sovereignty. Well, there's somebody who disagrees with that decision. You recognize this gentleman? It's another of our founding fathers, also was enslaved in our neighboring state of Maryland. Here's what he had to say at the time, because remember, this is what the Dred Scott decision is saying. They're not constituent members of the sovereignty. By the way, and what they're saying is that at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, states determined citizenship, and therefore, since African Americans were not recognized as citizens at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, they could never be recognized. Or else, and they say that in the decision, Taney does, the founders would be regarded as hypocrites. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, I think been there, done that. Somebody beat him to saying that about 80 years previously. But anyway, the dissent, and I encourage you to read, the dissenting opinion is by a Harvard Law graduate, Miss Justice Curtis, and he was the first Supreme Court justice, in my knowledge, that was a graduate, I think a graduate of law school, definitely a graduate of Harvard. And he takes apart that dissent, and what he says, which is true, is that, guess what? At the time of the adoption of the Constitution in Louisiana and in North Carolina, at least, people who were African American and free and owned property could vote. So it was a lie perpetrated on the American people, but it was a lie they wanted to believe. Here is what Frederick Douglass had to say. We the people, not we the white people, not we the citizens or the legal voters, not we the privileged class and excluding all other classes, but we the people. Not we the horses and cattle, but we the people, the men and women, the human inhabitants of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution. As you know, I'm going to flip back to that photo of Frederick Douglass. There's a new book out, I encourage you to read it, about how Frederick Douglass was very aware of photography, a newer medium at the time. It would become more famous, of course, with the Civil War. But he was aware, he was at the time that he lived the most photographed man in America. The most photographed man in America. And he saw the power of photography as a new medium to help average people see, I'm a man, I'm a person, I have flesh and bones. Don't talk about a slave in the abstract. I'm an enslaved person, maybe, because of your choice, but not mine, but see my humanity. See my humanity in the photographs. And now I come to the part of my talk that addresses our title, We the Whole People. This is Susan B. Anthony. And you know, this is a little girl spat, but hey, I'm on Lucy Stone's side, so she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were on the other side, but we're all part of one big family, right? Right. And she's the one who's sent to jail for trying to vote. And here's what she had to say. It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, not or yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women, as well as men. I promised you at the beginning that we'd talk about how to make a more perfect union from imperfect people. And I hope I've given you my street cred as a lover of your namesake and a lover of our constitutional system. But I think if we want to maintain it, if we want to make it constantly a more perfect union, we've got to expand our landscape, because we've unfortunately left some voices out, and for a long time, and they were not silent. They were included in the debates of the day. Why are they not in our history books? Why are they not in our stories and studies? And I hope you'll join me in making sure that their stories are recaptured. And before we go to questions and answers, I'd just like to make a point of personal privilege with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, as you may already know, she was to gender equality, women and men. She supported equal rights for men who were denied equality of certain benefits, particularly if their wives happened to be in the military. She was to women's rights what Justice Thurgood Marshall was to rights for civil rights and African American racial equality. She, as a litigator, did so much and worked so hard, and most people don't know that. I hope you'll correct that wrong too, but here's what she says that I'd like to use as my final comment. It manifests no disrespect for the Constitution to note that the framers were gentlemen of their time, and therefore had a distinctly limited vision of who counted among we the people. But equal dignity of all persons is nonetheless a vital part of our constitutional legacy, even if the culture of the framers held them back from fully perceiving that universal ideal. We don't have to give little Jimmy up, but we don't have to stop with him either. He was imperfect. He was a slaveholder in a society of slaveholders, in a nation that benefited from slavery, in a nation that continues to benefit from the fruits of slavery. I'm proud to be here with you. I'm proud to know that you're being recognized nationally for what you do to make this a society that honors we, the whole people. Thank you very much. Hi.
Hi, thanks so much for coming.
What's your name?
My name's Will.
Will?
Yeah.
Are you from Virginia?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So I took a class last year called Language, Law, and Ethics. And
Whoa.
we talked about the Constitution a lot. And one of the things we talked about is how technology has changed how people could interpret some of the amendments, such as privacy, for example, in regards to the Fourth Amendment. So my question for you is, as a fan of James Madison, how do you think he would apply the Constitution in the face of these new technologies?
You know, it's natural for us to ask those questions, right? And you know what Jimmy Madison, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm being disrespectful, I can't help it. You know what Jimmy Madison said to that? He said, shut up, I'm not gonna let you see my notes for 50 years. I don't want you to know what I thought about and I'm paraphrasing here, you know that, right? But I don't want you to know what I thought about the Constitution. I want you to figure it out. I hope I wasn't being disrespectful. That was a good question, and it's an appropriate question. But he doesn't want us to ask those. I know, and even Justice Scalia, God bless his soul, Justice Scalia would say, I don't care what the intent of the framers is. He says he looks at original meanings and common understandings. But you're right, they didn't have wiretapping, they didn't have heat sensing technology. One of the actually the PBS documentary that I worked in about the Constitution, it was this Israeli secret agent, and she was tough. And she said, privacy is a myth. And I don't want to believe that. I want to believe that still there are some hurdles that government agents have to go through. But as you probably already know, your generation more than anybody else has surrendered their privacy completely. And I'm hoping you are going to start reeling that sucker back in, because I really don't want to live in that kind of world. We already live in it to some extent. But thank you for your question.
Do you think, it's kind of in regards to what he said, do you think that the,
Tell me your name and where you're from.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Travis Valle. I'm from Alexandria originally. Do you think that the framers intentionally left a lot of kind of vagueness in the Constitution specifically for these things? For instance, like the necessary and proper, and just in the fact that we the people, that they didn't say specifically we the white landowning males? Like, do you think they left a lot of ambiguity in that specifically to make room for changes and possibly increases in equality?
Well, you're right that certainly Chief Justice Marshall says that. He says we must remember that it's a constitution we are expounding. And he said you don't want to be prolix, that means lots of words, like a statute. But he also turns around and says, but none of the words in the Constitution are without meaning. So Justice Marshall reminds me a lot of James Madison in the sense that he likes to be a balancer like that. As you know, in the Constitution, there's some things that are very specific. Like we argue a lot about what it means to be a natural-born citizen, to be the president. And we're still arguing about that today. President being 35, et cetera. But then, as you point out, the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause. Let's talk about Madison in that regard. James Madison fought very hard for the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause. What becomes even more important is when the Bill of Rights is proposed, number 10, what becomes number 10, also known as states' rights. That's the amendment that most states have recommended when they ratify the Constitution. James Madison says, you know, we really don't want the states to be in control of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, trial by jury, lists several things like that, and the Congress takes it out. Otherwise, you know that the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states for over 100 years. Remember that? Pardon me if I'm going into the weeds here, but the Bill of Rights just limited Congress. Madison had wanted to change that, but he didn't. So it's like this. It stretches in some places and it snaps back shut in others. I think that's probably why it's lasted so long, is that it's very specific in some areas and not. Did that answer your question? You think so?
Hi there. My name is Zach, and I am from Virginia.
All right. 1 second, Zach. Okay, I want some women. Come on. Speak up. No.
There's so many.
No, don't leave. I didn't say don't leave. Okay, good. We're all right now. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you for a wonderful chronology of the different periods when different peoples have created the whole in our whole people more inclusive. Looking towards where we are now, and things like Charlottesville, where white men are upset about how their rights are being infringed upon by trying to include more and more people into what was not originally meant to be for them. I wonder, when we look towards the hypothetical period when America was great, as someone who's so knowledgeable of these different periods, when more people are given equal rights and given equality, does that infringe upon the rights that are already held by people? Is there any legitimacy to people worrying that they will lose some of their rights if we give more to other people?
You're right, that's a very old argument. I mean, that's the argument from the beginning, right? John Adams didn't want white men without property to vote because he said they were too dependent. The next thing you know, women and children would want to vote. I tend to be an expansionist about rights. Just like creativity. It's like I'm not taking anything away from you to have my full humanity recognized, and that's my opinion. Unfortunately, a lot of people tend to see rights as a zero-sum game. You get some, I get some, it's a zero pie. I don't think that's, in my opinion, I don't think that's been our history. When women were treated with more equality, and there's still ways to go that, when people of different sexual identities, people of different sexual orientations are recognized. These are people who have always been there. I didn't take anything away from you to get mine. There's a song during the Civil Rights Movement that means a lot to me. It's called The Welcome Table. And my personal heroine, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a woman who finally was able to register to vote at the age of 45. She was the youngest of 20 children born to a sharecropper in Ruralville, Mississippi. She'd say, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." And people would say, "Well, don't you want rights equal with the white men?" She said, "No, I don't want to go down that low. I want to bring me and that white man up." That's what I say about that. Thank you for your question. And I would not have told you to sit down. I just want some more girls here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Amber. I was wondering, with the fact that I've never heard of some of the people that you mentioned today, which was just fascinating, and I was wondering.
You. And some people said they're not going to be interested in that history. They just are not interested in history. And then I'm not saying who said, but the people say that, and I just I'm one of the most powerful writers in America, won the Nobel Prize, William Faulkner, and he said, "The past is not dead. It's not even past." And I think Charlottesville just witnessed that. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, since we don't hear about these people in our elementary schools, even in our college schools, what does that do to what they fought for? What does that say for their voice? Exactly. And what does it say for our society as a whole that we're oppressing these people and silencing
Keep
their
preaching,
voices?
girl. Come on. I wasn't joking when I said call down the ancestors. You think they're not in this room here with us? Yes, they are. And so proud of you asking that question. You are being denied your right to a full and fair education if you are not being told these stories that are your birthright, that are part of your constitutional system. Thank you. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Come on, write some books for me now, all right? And I will give this plug of my book on the Bill of Rights that includes a lot of these stories, including Fannie Lou Hamer, will be out in the spring. And you can buy my book, The Words We Live By. Yes, okay. Yes, sir. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kathleen. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. I was just wondering, on a country that's been built on such inequality, do you think that it's even possible for us to have a perfect democracy and get to the point where everyone will be equal?
And now you're sounding like James Madison. I think you've been going to this school too long. Madison, part of why I love Madison and I trust him is because he's not an optimist. Come on, we're reading so much about, get happy, be happy, 10 ways to be happy. The founders talked about the pursuit of happiness, and that meant trying to live up to the values that you believed in. I believe with Dr. King that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I see your generation and the generation of Miss Heather Heyer, who will show up and not shut up and not sit down And you're the one that gives me hope. Yes, sir.
Yes, I liked your title a lot, including imperfect people.
Yes.
Imperfect people. And I'd like to probe more to what degree you're willing to include people who are imperfect.
Oh, keep going, I'm with you.
Okay, so...
For instance, I can hear it coming. There you go.
For instance, right.
Good rhetoric.
So we framers from the colonies looked out across the landscape and we saw different gradations of perfection. And so we wanted to have each of us our own established church, each one, 13 separate ones in 13 separate colonies. And the reason why was because we wanted to have control over whether we have things like, whether you agree with it or not, drag queens, marijuana. I'm not saying these are bad things necessarily, but we wanted to be able to control it.
Yeah.
So is there a right for privacy for the whole colony, for the whole community to exclude? Or is inclusion an absolute good?
Uh-oh, and now you're going to walk away. That's okay. It's all right. It's all right. But you know what? It's all right, because I could see you up at 2 o'clock in the morning burning the candle with James Madison talking about that. Can I speak to part of it? Because the second part of it is so huge. We'd be here all night. But to your point about the established church, which I mentioned earlier, we owe James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, but sorry, Jefferson gets all the credit, but Madison does all the work. Madison does all the work. Madison is the one who ran for office. Jefferson's not going to run for Congress, for God's sake. Writes a memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments. Is sympathetic with the Baptists. And by the way, I know today we live in a culture where Baptists are dominant. At that point, Baptists were the persecuted minority in the established church in Virginia. In fact, one of the occupations of the local Anglican, they became Episcopal after the Revolution, but of the local sheriff, and in Virginia still established what is now the Episcopal Church, they would go out Baptist hunting on the weekends. That's one of the stories in my book, where they tell the story of Baptists couldn't get a license to preach, right? Because it was established church. So they tend to have meetings out in the open. And guess what? They had meetings where people who were enslaved came because they believed that everybody's soul was equal, no matter what your status was in church. And that was very threatening to the landed gentry that paid the salary of the sheriff. And so they would go out. There was one story of where Brother Waller was out preaching with a great deal of liberty. Up rides the sheriff, up rides the Anglican priest, and they have a horsewhip. And they're trying to horsewhip him into stopping preaching, and he's praying the whole time and trying to get him to stop and pray. And then they still can't show it, so he starts singing. And we all know, coming from the South in particular, once people start singing, you're not going to shut them up. Okay, so he starts singing and preaching with a great deal of liberty, they said. That was in Virginia, well over 200 years ago. So when we look to Mr. Madison to say, we're not gonna keep with the established church, that's a big debt we owe him, and thank you for bringing that up. Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Samantha, I'm from New Jersey. I'm Samantha, I'm from New Jersey. Just based on your knowledge and how you said Madison wasn't an optimist, what do you think he would say about the current state of our nation or any changes he would make to the Constitution today?
This is actually one of the times where I'll cite Hamilton. I highly recommend to you a gentleman named Benjamin Wittes. I think I pronounce this. He's with the Brookings Institute now. He was the youngest editorial writer for the Washington Post. Not a lawyer, kind of like James Madison. And he gives the quote from Hamilton's Federalist paper where he talks about the danger in our society is that you'll have a person, I'm not saying who it is, it could be any person. Hamilton wrote about this, 200 years ago, but that is so popular and sees his power so great that essentially can't be stopped. Now, I will have to add a footnote about Hamilton. I think Hamilton would have been that way if he could have been elected. I really do. So sometimes, the pot calling the kettle black, but he was right about that. So in terms of what Madison would say, I hope he would call it out. But like I told the other gentleman, he burned his papers. He wrote it in the notes of the convention. That's all, folks. It's your problem now.
Hi, I'm Lauren, and I'm from Virginia. I've always been curious. Do you think the framers of the Constitution will be disappointed in us as how we interpret it?
I may have summoned too many ancestors. But that's okay, they're here, okay? They want to know. This is generally my answer to that is because we use the word framers, and I used it tonight, right? Like it's one set of people. And if we're talking about the Constitution, it was 55 men, of whom 38 technically signed it, but one signed twice for another guy who wasn't there who had told him to sign for it, so it's 39. They were so different. They were so different. You look at James Madison versus Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry and George Washington are all in favor of you have to pay taxes to support your religion, all right? You have people like Thomas Jefferson, who thinks Jesus is the greatest moral teacher who's ever lived, but he's an Enlightenment scientist, so he cuts and pastes out all of the miracles from his Bible, and that's the Jeffersonian Bible. So we have to be careful. And as we know about, just this throwdown with Madison and Hamilton, they came to represent very different visions of what our system would be. I think they would be, as the Brits say, gobsmacked. Look at this, gobsmacked. Look at all these women, and you thought Dolly had a big mouth. Good Lord, Dolly, by the way, another lady after my heart. And there was no question that Jefferson, that Madison, Washington too, although he could see further ahead, believed in that myth that people with different skin colors are inherently unequal. They could say, this is where when people get too abstract, it kind of bothers me, because Jefferson will say, when you read Notes of Virginia, he'll say, but they're equal in their rights, they're just not equal in their abilities. We can see now that people are not as unequal in abilities as we thought. Did that answer your question? You really? Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Sophia. I'm from Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm super glad that I came to your talk. It was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
And I feel like it's also very relevant in our time because you kind of see, and what you were just talking about too, kind of also got little sparks going in my head. How even though all the founding fathers were very much similar in that they were all basically rich white men, they had a diverse array of ideas and visions for the future. And in our time, we have also lots of people with very diverse visions of the future and diverse ideas. And sometimes they can't always get along. And I guess what I really want to hear kind of your opinion on, or what I've been thinking about a lot, is how do you think our generation can really reconcile those differences and maybe try and fix it and make a more perfect union?
Thank you for doing me the honor of asking me that question. But you know what I'm going to say, right? What am I going to say? It's on you, babe. I can help. What my job, excuse me, I didn't mean to yell quite that loudly, but I'm a storyteller. I don't want these stories to be lost. That's why I'm here now. You've heard those stories now. You're going to tell them some more, right? Aren't you? okay? You have the most promise of any generation we've produced in this country. We've not done a perfect job, but we've done the best job of educating you than we've done of anybody before. And, you know, I'm a baby boomer, so sometimes when I go on social media and I see the millennials dissing me, I'm saying, wait a minute, people. When we went to college, your president was regarded as your parent, and you had no free speech rights. So, you know, just start giving a little credit for that. What I see is that you guys are capable of working together. And what I'm glad is we talk about bricks and mortar, you've now got a physical community, because the most recent article I saw is that millennials are lonely. That's up to you to discuss. I'm an old person, I don't get to vote in that. Don't be lonely. Come to places like this, because there's just certain things that you can't get technologically, except a vote and a changed law, and I'm counting on you on that, okay?
We're gonna do these last two questions, so I'll ask no one else to approach the mic. This gentleman was here first, and then we'll finish with you.
Hi, Ms. Monk. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Devin. I'm from Reston, Virginia. And I have a two-part question for you. So to my understanding, the basis of the Second Amendment at the time it was written was to prevent a rise of government tyranny in this country. So I just wanted to ask you, do you personally believe that millennials have been pushing for too much government power? And do you believe resistance from government tyranny is still a relevant reason for U.S. citizens to own guns in 2017?
Okay. Thank you for breaking down parts. I'm going to say, I'm sure your generation doesn't like being stereotyped any more than I do, okay? There are some general truths, but they're not all truths. My nephew is a millennial and a libertarian millennial, and he's always busted my chops about the Constitution. I don't get no respect. And he owns an AK-47 and whatever multiple weapons, and my husband's a gun owner in a gun-owning state, and I grew up in a gun-owning state, so we store it for him. If you're asking me about the Second Amendment, as a constitutional scholar, we look at the current critique, and this is, I hope how you're going to know I try and be intellectually honest. The current critique is that, oh, the NRA resurrected this out of thin air, and nobody ever believed in it before. Actually, the person who resurrected the Second Amendment argument that it is indeed an individual right, because when we talk about rights of the people in the First Amendment, we don't say that's a collective right. In the Fourth Amendment, we don't say that's a collective right. So why in the Second Amendment do we start saying collective right? And yes, there's a dependent clause, but dependent clauses don't always control. The person who resurrected that argument was a very liberal constitutional scholar who still lives and is a great man, but I think he regrets writing the article called The Forgotten Second Amendment, and he basically accused liberals of being hypocrites, and said, okay, if you believe in rights of the people and everything else, you should apply the Second Amendment too. And it took off from there, including my constitutional law mentor, Larry Tribe at Harvard. So that argument about individual rights has been supported by people in the legal academy that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Okay, now the second part was, what are millennials doing about it? Remind me the second part.
I was asking if you think millennials are pushing for too much government power?
In terms of firearms specifically?
There's multiple ways, but just like overall your opinion, and if you think that protection from government tyranny is still relevant in 2017.
Oh, wow. Well, that one I can answer real quick. Duh. James Madison said, the greatest danger of tyranny is where there is the most power. And in our government, the most power is in the majority of the people, and that's where the infringement of rights is chiefly to be feared. So here it comes. You're part of actually you're the biggest generation right now, and now you're the biggest generation in the workforce, so you're going to be firing me. And I don't want to paint with that broad a brush. I do think, to your credit, that this generation, as recognized by the Diversity Award, generally treats people a lot better than people did when I was growing up in my generation. Now, if you think that should be done through government power or individual influence, that's on you. But I will say, we didn't get to where we are without the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, without the Civil Rights Act. So before you start throwing away all those laws, think about what it may have given you first, okay? Promise? Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
I'm Natalie. I'm from Virginia. And I was just wondering if, in your opinion, if we're currently working to recapture the voices of those who you said were silenced. And if we are, like, how can we expand upon those efforts? And I guess if we're not too, like, how can we?
You know, this is really interesting, and I applaud your professors, because generally when I do this kind of speech, like at the Smithsonian or various people aren't asking me questions, they're telling me their opinions. And 201, you've actually asked what I think. I'm just like, I'm eclipsed, you know? Tell me, what was the story that you heard today that made the biggest impression on you?
I would actually have to go with the Dred Scott case, just because I never like heard about the family or anything like that, and I thought that was just really inspirational how it's separated and you don't hear about that.
And you know what? When I was putting this talk together, and I was saying, come on, little Jenny, help me. This is not coming through. This is not coming through. And I have everything I want to say, and it's just this little piece. And I kept trying to click on his picture and put it, and it wouldn't go. It would not. He was not going to show up tonight. But you know who showed up? Dred Scott, big time. Once I got that picture of Dred Scott there, and he was staring back at me, I said, okay, this is what we're talking about. And then once I saw the pictures of his family, and I was able to figure out how to cut and paste them to put to the family, it was like, okay. And then I heard about Harriet, and we were done then. And then I heard about the little girls turning 10, and what was going to happen to them, and what was going to happen to their family. Thanks for telling that story. Thanks for letting me share it with you today.